Welcome to this deck of Galadriel of Lothlorien. This is a very good commander, I think. It's a 3 mana elf noble that says whenever the ring tempts you, if you chose a creature other than Galadriel of Lothlorien as your ring bearer, scry 3. That's a lot to scry, and the only downside is that you will need to have the ring tempt you. And this is not a very common mechanic, especially not in Commander, so that is really not what we are mainly doing here. The second ability is most important. Whenever you scry, you may reveal the top card of your library. If a land card is revealed this way, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Now if you can scry 3 for example, then you can make sure that there is a land on top and then something you want to keep in your hand right after that. So that you will get the land and then later get the card that you want, which always was the fun thing about scrying. Now, there are some things that can help you tempt. Now I will not go over all of the examples, just the best ones I could find. Bombadil's Song is a protection spell that also tempts you, so also helps you scry a bit before protecting, for example, your commander. And then there's Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, another elf noble for 3 mana. That's very flavorful as well in the story. That says whenever Elrond or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. If you are lucky and you find a land every time, this does mean that you can ramp very fast with these two, both 3 mana elves. Also note that the second time then that the ability has resolved, the ring tempts you, so you will get to scry 3 in that case. Now there are some very easy combos, I would say, with Simic Growth Chamber and, for example, Kodama of the East 3. What Simic Growth Chamber does is it enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you can return a land you control to its owner's hand. So this triggers your Kodama triggers. You get to put Simic Growth Chamber back into your hand. And then Kodama says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield, which is a long thing. Note that this also works with tokens, of which we have a few. And especially the ones that are made by landfall are interesting, because when Simic Growth Chamber enters the battlefield, it also might trigger, for example, Tireless Tracker, which says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, investigate, which means to create a clue token, which has a converted mana cost of 0, just like your land. So this means that when Tireless Tracker triggers, you get a clue token and you can put Simic Growth Chamber back onto the battlefield, meaning that you can do this over and over, and in the meantime you will get an endless amount of clues. This works with other types of tokens too, so that's why this is a good combo. The only expensive part there being the Kodama of the East 3. Now there is another thing which isn't really a full combo, but this one says Retreat to Coral Helm, says landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you choose 1. I would say this is already almost a combo, because if you can make sure that you have a lot of lands on the top of your library, then every time you play one or get one from the battlefield, on the battlefield from your ability from Galadriel, you may scry 1 again. So this can go on infinitely. So if you have a way in which you can put only lands on the top of your library, like with this one, Scouting Track, you can do this infinitely. So you can put all of those lands that you wanted to put onto the battlefield with Galadriel. Now, of course, we need a lot of scrying, and we have some good things there as well. One thing that I like is when scrying triggers on something entering the battlefield. In this deck, we have a lot of ways in which we can put creature tokens or other types of tokens onto the battlefield whenever we scry or put a land onto the battlefield. So when that happens, Season of Growth will make sure that whenever that creature enters, you will again scry 1. This means that you might get another land, and that means that you might get another creature, which again makes it an eternal cycle if you are lucky in that case. But of course, with the scrying you can have, well, you need a little bit less luck. Yeah, so Sylvan Anthem, sort of the same thing. Whenever a green creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. Most of the tokens that we make are green, so that also works. And then there's reason to believe. Well, the reason part is scry 3, which isn't bad, but then the belief part says to look at the top card of your library, put it onto the battlefield if it's a creature card. And that works very well with scrying as well, because we can choose what's on the top of our library. And put it onto the battlefield for just 5 mana instead of a lot. Note that all of these scries just work really well with Galadriel as well, and they make a sort of combo almost too. Now there are some payoffs as well. Elrond is back again with a sort of payoff. Whenever you scry, put a +1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of cards looked at. And then whenever a creature with a +1 counter on it becomes the target of a spell, you draw a card, but mostly he is here to grow all of your tokens and creatures for all of the scrying you are doing. And then the temporal anchor. The most important part is whenever you choose to put 1 or more cards on the bottom of your library while scrying, which we will be doing a lot, exile that many cards from the bottom of your library. During your turn you may play those cards, exiled with the temporal anchor. So not instant speed, but still a strong thing to do to keep all of those cards too, sort of. Then there is, from the Lord of the Rings set, the Palantir of Orthanc, which says at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on Palantir and scry 2. We like that. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters, and the player loses life equal to the total mana value. But actually here, we kind of mostly like the scrying of the scrying that we get at the end of our end steps. Plus, of course, we can choose very well what goes on top of our library, and we can sort of fake our opponents out. And that means that we can that we might get to deal a bunch of damage as well. And we don't mind milling what we are milling, basically. So we have Augur of Autumn, which works with the top of our library, and in this way there are many more, like the scrying card that we saw before as well. But this one says you may play lands, which we like, and then as long as you have Coven, you may cast creature spells from the top of your library as well, so this really helps us too. Coiling Oracle says to put a land card onto the battlefield, so sort of redundancy, which I always like and I always preach about. And then Genesis Wave is an X spell where you reveal the top X cards of your library and put any number of permanents with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. So you will need a bunch of mana for this, but you can choose pretty easily what goes on top of your library. Now you saw before that landfall works very well. This is because there are a bunch of cards that make a token whenever a land enters the battlefield, and as you saw there are a bunch of strategies in this deck that work with the ETBs of tokens as well, making you go infinite with all of these cards. So we don't really care about their big stats, like with Rampaging Balos. We would prefer the cheaper Scoot Swarm, actually, because, well, infinite Scoot Swarms is probably enough to finish the game with some of the other cards that we have here. Now there are some other things that go with landfall, Retreat to Coral Helm being one of them, of course. But Ashaya makes all of our creatures lands as well, so that helps us trigger the landfall too with all of the creatures. And Awaken the Woods makes creatures as well, but those are also forests, so that is also something we like. Now we do need to finish the game, just like I said before, and these are actually the last 3 that I will show you, but the link to the deck is also in the description. Now, Song of Arendelle is one I like mostly for the flavor around the elves, but the last one says, the last chapter says, put a flying counter on each creature you control without flying. We will have a bunch of big creatures, and we want to give them all evasion, so that we can finish the game. This one also says scry 2, so we like that too, of course. Now there is Elfish Mariner, which says whenever you scry, tap up to X target permanence, where X is the number of cards looked at. We do scry a lot, and this card also scries herself, so that also helps. But we will get to tap all of the creatures, hopefully, from an opponent. And then there's Cultivated Colossus, which helps us put a bunch of lands from the top of our deck onto the battlefield. We have, as I said before, ways to put only lands on top of our library, or however many we want, so that we can keep putting them onto the battlefield and drawing a bunch of our decks. So this is another way to combo off. And then you have the Cultivated Colossus, which is just a big trampler if you get to survive the round with it. So a bit less favorable to me, because we will be a go wide strategy most of the time. But this is just another way to do it, and I would not put it on in my deck, is what I would say. But it was it for this deck. Let me know what other cards you would like to see in it, and maybe we can make the deck better together too. Have a nice day.